Good afternoon. Welcome to the seminar. As all of you know, in the Indian agriculture, pulses and oilseeds are always sticky problems, and policymakers have been trying to address this for a long time, and not much success, I should say. Many policies for tried out, and today's lecture is about whether these policies are effective or not, and the topic is striving to revive pulses in India, extension policy, subsidy, input subsidies, and output price support. Whether these policies are effective or not. So to talk about it, we have Professor Travis Driver. He's Professor at Agriculture and Resource Economics, University of California, Davis campus. Works on a wide variety of topics, applied microeconomics, ranging from poverty dynamics, hope and aspirations, and nutrition to digital financial inclusion, agriculture technology adoption, and innovation policy. He collaborates with researchers, students, NGO, government, and all stakeholders of policy, and including private firms. He has lived and worked in India on a PhD thesis. And of course, he has worked in Haiti and throughout Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, and Europe. He has had visiting researcher appointment at the Intellectual Property Division of the WTO, and at the Economics and Statistics Division of the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO. And at the University of Ghana, Germany, Sweden, and Netherlands. He has served as co-editor of the American Journal of Economics and was a Fulbright scholar in Morocco before earning his PhD in applied economics from Cornell University. So he's a member of the standing panel for impact assessment of CGIAR system and an affiliate of the Center for Effective Global Action at UC
Thank you. Thanks, Gopal. It really is great to be here. I have spent a lot of time in India over the years, but it's been 18 years, I think, since I've been in Bangalore, and it's changed a lot since I was last year. So it's a great excuse to be back here, and certainly appreciate the welcome. So the work that I'll present is a collaboration with a colleague of mine, Ashish Shenoy, and who is, as you can tell from the name, he's of Indian heritage, but he was born and raised in St. Louis. So I'll tell you a funny story about Ashish that relates to this project. Is when we were in Bihar, this happened multiple times. We were in Bihar meeting with people, and Ashish, I clearly don't look like I should understand the language, but Ashish definitely does. And so we would be in these meetings. It would be about 10 minutes in, and eventually one of them would ask, like, our partner, "What's wrong with him?" Like, it's like, is he broken? Because he should understand all this, but he's like asking for translation. So anyway, so Ashish is one of my colleagues at UC Davis, and then two former students who worked on this as students. The first, let me make sure that this is gonna, okay, there we go. So the first few slides here are actually going to be, like, many of you could probably tell this story better than I could, but I will do my best, right? So, and it follows on directly as Gopal introduced the topic that pulses in India have always been an interesting topic in agriculture. And one of the interesting twists with pulses is that these incredible advances in the Green Revolution really pushed pulses predominantly to the periphery. In most of agriculture in India, they got pushed to the periphery, both like spatially, they got pushed to like border crops or marginal land, and then even like within states, like you can see this kind of shift in where pulses are grown. Okay. And that's mainly a reflection of the fact that there has been dramatic improvements in other staple crops. So the relative productivity of pulses has taken a nosedive in the last 40 or 50 years. And that set the stage for this pulse price spike about 10 years ago, over 10 years ago, starting in, I think, 2011, 2010, 2011. And there was a lot that, and this is part of the story that many of you could tell better than I could. It became a political issue. It became a very important macroeconomic issue, because a lot of the inflation, it turned out, was being driven by this spike in pulse prices, and then that just sort of pointed to this change in the production of pulses and the fact that Indian farmers were just not producing pulses like they used to, right? And so this dependence on imported pulses, and you see some of the headlines here, but it sort of sounded the alarm on trying to improve or increase pulse production. So if you think of what does that mean when the alarm bell sounds, and this project really was born in Niti Aayog. So Niti Aayog was the one, among others, sounding this alarm, saying we have to figure out this pulse problem. When they sound the alarm, I mean, here are some of the two basic options, right? You can figure out more favorable ways to access imports, and you can sort of make a play in that direction. That's, of course, especially in India, politically complex. It relies on market integration at like the village level, right? So, and then the second option is to try to stimulate domestic production. So Niti Aayog decided that they really wanted to make like an all hands on deck push to try to stimulate domestic pulse production. There's a few, there's a few reasons why that was their preferred option. What we do in this project, and I'll sort of move quickly through some of these slides. What we do, we were not part of that. We were certainly not part of that decision. We came into the picture after Niti Aayog decided that they wanted to throw everything they could at trying to stimulate domestic pulse production, and they wanted, so the Gates Foundation ended up funding this pilot project, this pulse project in Bihar, and then they reached out to us to design an evaluation to know whether it worked, right? So that's the backdrop. Now the intervention I'll define in a lot more detail, but basically when they thought, we just have to throw everything we can at this problem, what they had in mind was, I mean, it's everything that you might think of. It's like short-term extension support, learning, demos, expert advice, input subsidies, making access to certified seed easy, even free at the first, and then also providing like pulling farmers into the market with output price supports. Okay, so it was like those, and you'll see those three things. I'll describe them in a little bit more detail as we go on. So this is that's the set of interventions. It's an intensive short-term intervention that's aimed to trigger long-term change, right? So the idea is here over a couple of years, if you just throw everything you can you bump farmers into a different equilibrium? Can you push them into a different space where suddenly you bring pulses out from off of the periphery and into kind of the central portfolio of production portfolio of these farmers? And the basic logic was, this short period of time with a lot of support and encouragement, that would trigger farmers like waking up to the fact that pulses aren't as bad as their fathers and grandfathers said they were. That it triggers some learning, and then if you can pull in those, change incentives by pulling farmers in through output markets. Via, in this case, these farmer producer corporations that actually were set up. They were dedicated kind of pulse specific farmer producer corporations that were set up as part of this project. Right. So it really is, there's a lot of things going on to try to make pulse production as favorable as possible. What we find, and this is like the punchline, is that farmers respond to all of that support by adopting pulses. much more than they had in the past and more than the control group. They produce more pulses, they sell more pulses, they have more pulses in storage. But as soon as you start to dial back the support, they just revert back to the old equilibrium, right? So there's no evidence that it actually like changed the equilibrium, even though you're changing behavior on the margin, right? So once the support fades, it's back to business as usual.
So
yep.
You mean like once the support is there any particular support that is, or all of it is removed?
Well, yeah, no, so that's a good point. So the things that are so the extension, this like dedicated pulse extension, and you'll see in the timeline, it covers like 2 years. Input subsidies cover like the first year, and then they're waned out on the like free the first year for these seeds, and then 50%. So these are the things that are dialed back. The FPCs continue to exist. They continue to exist, but these like favorable output prices, as I'll kind of describe that experiment that we do, those also get dialed back. So it is like, you know, there's a version of this you can imagine, like if these were permanent output price supports, like does that change? And so we'll see. We'll see by the end if you know what you think.
Yeah, I'm also wondering like what is driving the results, and it's like a bunch of things affecting. So it would be nice if something like output prices would have continued, and then you could have at least said that
separate from
yes, there's some variation in
I think that so the way you'll see that in the timeline these didn't all happen at the same time, but we still can't disentangle that quite the way you're suggesting. Okay, so the context, and this I'll go over really quickly. This is just kind of on the screen what I mentioned here in terms of productivity, right? So there's these massive productivity gains in terms of cereals, but nothing even close to that in pulses. India continues to be like the dominant market both for production and consumption in pulses, and which for good reason, right? Because they're such an important source of protein. The other little, and this I have a question mark here because I know that it's somewhat of a contentious finding from Deaton and Drez, which they find that rural protein consumption actually fell per capita over like a 15-year period. It's at least a provocative finding, and there's some controversy about whether it's actually true. But so there's a really important protein kind of nutrition problem here as the backdrop. As far as like the technology side, so now thinking about just farmer decisions. So knowledge among farmers is often a barrier to adoption. And that's sort of the premise here, is that there's something that farmers don't know or don't realize about pulses that is causing them to push them to the periphery. And then also there's a lot of literature here on the importance of hands-on demonstration to try to enhance learning, right? So that's how you can kind of get past that barrier. The one I'll mention that's sort of similar, and I'll come back to this, is this DT drought-tolerant rice experiment in Odisha that also uses like intensive hands-on demonstration. In that case, they actually find sustained adoption, right? So I'll come back to why I think there's an important difference there. The other thing to note, though, is that in our case, like knowledge may be a barrier. Knowledge of certified pulses, knowledge of like producing pulses in kind of a monocrop way that's not like bringing them off the periphery and really taking them seriously as a crop. So knowledge is probably a constraint, but it's certainly not the only barrier, right? These unattractive output prices are certainly one of them, and so those incentives. Those market incentives matter, and we see that in a lot of different studies. Some of these really fit the theory of change here. So, for example, this work is looking at short-term input subsidies for maize in Mozambique, and that actually sort of pushes farmers into a different equilibrium. So it's a short-term nudge that actually like sustained change in their production in their production system. And then there's a few others, like, you know, in terms of how you combine those incentives with training. As I said, we find certainly evidence that's consistent with that, except that once you end the learning, or once you end the subsidy, like that, it's just a reversion back to that equilibrium. All right, so what I'll do here is give a really simple theory for how you might think about a temporary intervention that creates kind of a long-term change. And then I'll talk through the intervention and the study design and go through the results and then the input experiment results and then the output support results. So here's the theory. So here, should I attempt this? Is this ready to go here? Can I? Oh, I guess it's just like a hand here. Maybe I can. Okay. So what we have here is the I won't play with that. So this is a production function as a function of x, which is the input. So think of this as a really simple model. There's two production functions. There's a low production function and a high production function. So the way to think about this is this low production function. You can think of that as like traditional. We'll think of that as like the traditional pulses on the periphery production functions per pulses, right? It's like they're on the marginal land, they're on the border, you squeeze them in wherever you can, you don't take them very seriously, you don't weed very much, you know, so that's the low technology. The higher production function is taking pulses more seriously. It's a certified, maybe it's an improved variety. You're treating them like any other crop. So this takes a little bit more investment. So there's this like sort of fixed cost investment to get the higher technology. And then these are both ISO profit lines. The way to think about that, the easiest way to think about that is just they're the inverse market price, right? Output price. So the way you think about in this kind of a setup, the way these points, the points of tangency are these points of optimal. So this is optimal input use for the low technology. This is optimal input use for the high. And then you're just basically comparing which of these gets you to the highest ISO profit line, which in this case is the low. So this is sort of depicting the way Niti Aayog was really thinking about. I don't know if it's this model, but this is kind of the way they talked about it was that pulses were stuck in this low equilibrium. Okay? That even though there were more productive ways to grow pulses, that there's a reason why, you know, given the market prices, that's where they were at. So what this intervention aims to do is first to provide input support. So this is like an import subsidy. So this is just one way you can think of that is it's just taking those ISO profit lines and shifting it out by the subsidy. So you can think about doing that, and then when you do that, you also incentivize farmers to apply more of the input, and so you can sort of think about pushing them to a higher equilibrium by input support, right? So where the higher profit line is the modern technology. The hope is really that triggers, even after you dial back the input support, that it triggers some learning by doing, and that actually changes the shape of the production function, that they learn how to use the high technology better, right? So the change shape of the production function, this F prime, is capturing this learning by doing that allows you to kind of to reach a higher profit even with the subsidy retracted, right? Even when the subsidy ends. Or at the end of all that, you could fall back to exactly where you started. Right, which is what we see, right? So this is sort of what we see is you get this effect. Definitely, you see that. You take the subsidies away and you slip back to this, right? So there's no like evidence of pronounced learning by doing. The output price support works by changing the slope of this line. So it's the inverse. So the inverse of the output price. So this line becomes shallower because it's the inverse of that if you're offering more favorable prices. And so you can sort of induce farmers to the higher technology by changing the outputs. So same exact logic. And you could add then here the learning by doing. And so you could combine these things, but the trick is there has to be And for Niti Aayog, it's clear that they didn't want to like sign off on a project that was going to be 30 years of intensive support for pulses. What they wanted, what every policymaker wants, is the quick fix, right? They want the magic that like 2 years of investment and then they get like a lifetime of returns, right? Okay, so this is let me talk a little bit more about the study area. So this is in Bihar, these 5 districts. The districts, and Bihar, I should say, especially I think the southern part of Bihar, although someone could correct me probably here, I think this used to be a part of the pulses belt. Like there were, the great grandfathers of current farmers actually grew a lot of pulses in parts of Bihar. Pulses in these districts were a lot more important in the 50s and 60s than they are now. Right? So this is one of these places where they've just been pushed to the periphery. So these are the districts where we worked. These are the pulses that we worked with. I mean, I say we, but this was a actually, let me jump to this. Just so when I'm talking about we, it's clear what we're talking about. So Niti Aayog is the one that commissioned this study, funded by the Gates Foundation. And then, so we here is really the implementing partner, who's the Aga Khan Foundation. And then they worked with a bunch of, one in each district, local NGO partners, right? So that's kind of who I mean by we. So they selected these pulse crops, pigeon pea and black gram for the Kharif season, lentil, chickpea, green pea, and fava for the pulse or for the Rabi season, and then for this Zaid season, this kind of like super short season. The hope was that they could squeeze in one crop of green gram. Now that's sort of a topic for another. There's an interesting, we always talk about there being no free lunch. Like this is one case where, if you look at it on paper, this seems like a free lunch. It's like we could just squeeze in this one extra crop. Of course, like no free lunch is a real thing. Like there's a lot of trade-offs with other crops to make room for it. But that was the menu, right? Those were the menu of pulses that they were interested in promoting. Pigeon pea is a particularly hard sell because it covers both seasons. And we see that, right? We sort of see a glimmer of appeal to some of the other pulses. Black gram, green pea, you see a lot of action there, but pigeon pea is a tough one. So here's to Eddie's question. This is the rollout of this intervention in year 1. So it's treatment and control. And I'll talk about the kind of the randomization in a moment. But in year 1, the treated areas got free certified seed and pretty heavy extension support with a demo plot. There's another version of the treatment where they just get the free seeds. So we can sort of look at on the margin the impact of the extension support. In the control areas, they have access to certified seeds, but they're paying full market prices. So they do get something, right? Because this is actually, in this area, it's hard to find certified pulse seeds, right? So they get access to the certified seeds. In year 2, we have the same thing going. It's just that instead of free seeds, it's subsidized. So they're basically paying half of the market price. And then the treatment is merged at this point. So now even this group that just got the seeds, now they get extension. So these two things get merged, and the control continues to have access to the certified seed at market prices. In year 3, we go to market prices everywhere. The extension ends, and then we do this output price experiment. So the output price experiment is only in the treated areas, and we're working through FPCs to offer them. Essentially, what we want to do is offer them what is the announced minimum support price for pulses, right? So this is a part of the Indian agricultural system. There's a lot of the Indian agricultural system that is perplexing to an outsider. This is one of them, is that there are these announced minimum support prices, but there's not a procurement mechanism to actually give farmers those prices, as I understand it, right? So what we are trying to do is just take the minimum support price take it at face value, and through the farmer producer companies, like actually offer them that price, and then see if you get any kind of a supply response.
Sorry.
Yep.
So year 1, year 2, there is no
Yeah.
support?
No,
The output support comes.
it comes exactly. So this is, and the reason it was sort of by design, because we were thinking this learning by doing, this was kind of like, they had 4 seasons, 2 years, but 4 production seasons, 6 if you count the Zayed season, but I'm not sure I count that. But they had 4 seasons to kind of learn in these treated areas and to try to like make adjustments to their production portfolios. And so just to kind of figure out the production function. And then this was offered, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, but this was offered after, so they were kind of sequenced in that way, yeah.
So that means year 1, year 2, there is only input subsidy. You are reducing the cost of
Yeah.
production.
Yeah.
Output they are selling in regular mandis, no MSP.
Well, so that, I mean, it's true. They if they're selling at all, they're selling in the regular mandis. In reality, not very many of them sell. We do see an increase, but it's from a very, very low base. So in this area, like farmers that are growing, exactly, own consumption. Yep. Which for our purposes was going to be fine, right? Because so there was a big nutrition angle to this whole project that I'll kind of gloss over a little bit, but trying to track like the actual consumption of pulses, how many months they have pulses. Because the one thing we know in this context from a lot of the qualitative work we did is that the day that their own pulse stock runs out, the frequency of pulse consumption drops by about half, right? And so if you can, so that consumption side is important. I don't want to downplay it, but they weren't selling in the market that much yet.
One last clarification.
Yeah.
So are we saying that they are growing pulses on the side, not dedicating the entire land?
Yeah.
To
Yeah, that's mostly how they're either as a border crop. So literally, as I said, pushed to the periphery of the plots, like or they may be intercropped in some places. Basically, they're trying to kind of squeeze pulses in a way that reduces the opportunity cost. They don't want to give up any area in their land that's going to rice or wheat or turmeric in this case, or vegetables, right? Yeah.
And NITI Aayog's objective was to encourage this.
Yep.
As a side.
Yep. It was exactly. They really did want to bring it off the periphery. They wanted to just see more pulse production. Now they didn't care so much. I mean, obviously the big macro concern was about getting more pulses into the market, but they realized that even just extending, there's the nutrition side too. So just extending the pulse stocks in these households would be a success. Yeah. Yep.
Just a couple of questions. So the output sale, was it that you're procuring, or you're just like announcing the price?
Well, so this was the advantage that we had here, because so what happened was these NGOs, Aga Khan Foundation supported these NGOs to kind of create these FPCs, right, as part of the project. So that's basically what gives us this unique opportunity, because we were working behind the scenes to design that and say, like, these are the procurement prices, but it was actually procured by the FPC.
Oh.
So it wasn't just like, it was like, so it was announced before planting, before they made decisions, they said, in this village, like for black gram, this is the price we will pay. In the case of the price floor. So that's the one that mimics the minimum support price. There's a per unit subsidy, which is essentially in expectation is the same amount. It's the same value, right, in expectation, but instead it's just like we will pay, and I forget what it was to create. It was like an 8%. We're going to take the market price and we'll pay you 8% more than the market price.
Oh, okay.
So yeah.
They were being like some subsidy over.
Yep. But it was procured. It was like the FPC was committing to procuring it from them at that price level. All, of course, backfilled by the project, right? So the FPCs were sort of made whole in the project, but yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
No.
So I'm just trying to understand this. So I'm a farmer in one of those states.
Yeah.
I'm growing it on the side for consumption in my own household or maybe extended household. Now, and it's lucrative for me because either the seeds are free or 50%.
Yeah.
There is input subsidy.
Right.
I'm not even looking to sell it in the market.
Yeah.
In year 3, suddenly now there is no input subsidy. I have to pay the market price.
Yeah.
And based on my previous experience, assuming I grew last 2 years, I am only looking to kind of use it for my own consumption. I mean, unless based on my previous year experience, I would like to now open it up and grow it. In the larger and I want to take it to the market. Does it make sense for me to actually start growing?
Well, so this let me actually jump to, because let me jump to this version, because you're in terms of the timing, you're right. Okay, so this is just a graphical depiction of what I've said. So year 1 and year 2, this is, as you said, like this is year 1, and then year 2 they're combined, and then this is the output experiment in year 3. Now, so everything you said is true. The only thing I would sort of slightly revise is that the part of the intent here is to see if there's a supply response. Those households that were primarily growing for own consumption, if you can trigger a supply response with more favorable output prices, right? So this was like that was part of the intent, is like if you can offer these prices and draw them into actually producing, and it all comes that they're notified of that procurement option at the beginning of the season, so they can adjust their portfolio. Yeah, you had.
I was just trying to understand. So, what's the incentive for the farmers to continue? So, what's the learning here? In the sense that
maybe I think it can feel completely presentation.
Let me. I'll go into data, but I'll come to that because I think I know kind of the question I think you were going to ask. So the household data we have is 3 years, 6 different rounds of data collection on production and consumption. Very detailed consumption data because we wanted to get we worked closely with nutritionists to get like protein. So we wanted to like be able to measure protein in particular. So we were working with both like someone who's the food preparer. Usually this is in like a traditional household, this would be the male head and this would be the female household head. The final round we did by phone because COVID hit. So this was like our final round was going to be like April, May of 2020. And so we did that one by phone. We did have an experimental auction through the FPC. This is the other thing, like having the FPC was nice because we could also, they were going to take orders from farmers anyway for pulse seeds. Like that was one of their purposes, was to like aggregate these orders and then place the order for the certified pulse seeds. So what we did is just kind of introduced an experimental twist to the way they collected orders so that we can basically just map out a demand curve for farmers, right? And so we can actually see if the intervention actually changed their valuation of whether demand curves shifted as a result of being exposed to the intervention. And then the other thing that we use here as data is the administrative data from the FPC. So they had their own like data dashboard, a system for collecting data from their members. So we have access to that for some of the other things. And mostly that serves to kind of verify or validate what we see in the survey data. So everything, I'll go quickly through this. We see pretty good balance across all these basic characteristics. Mostly male, as I said, were the farm respondent. Mostly female, the food respondent. Household characteristics, a bit of a difference in household size. So we control for all these things that are whether you see a slight difference. So then the timeline. This is these are the years covered with these different seasons. So the kickoff. Oh, I missed this. I'll just mention. So the randomization happens. The randomization happens at the village level. And then the sample selection happens with a kickoff meeting that we hold in all villages, treatment and control. That was just about pulse farming in general, right? So the farmers that show up become part of the population, and we randomly select those farmers to be in the sample from whom we'll collect the data. And then this is the progression, as I said. So you have this kind of 2 treatment arms initially. They get merged after the year 1, after these 2 or say 3 seasons, and then we go another year and then have the output price experiment. right? So that's the timeline. So what do we see? So the way we estimate this is really simple. It's just going to be looking at these outcomes of interest as a function of these year-specific treatment effects, right? So we do want to see if there's like sort of a dynamic treatment effect and allow for those years because the treatment is changing. We include year and block fixed effects in all of these. And then a number of household characteristics, as I mentioned, as controls. When we experiment with a lot of other, there's a PDS lasso version. Like you can be really creative with what goes in the X, and basically none of these results really change from what I'll show you. So here's what we see. So this is graphically, this is the initial adoption response that you see appear in year 1. So the gap, so this first one, it's small, I'm sure. So this is the share that are planting pulses. So in control, it's about 20%, and in treatment, it's about 40%. So it about doubles the share. This is the average pulse area planted in acres. So these are, this is 0.1 of an acre. That measure takes into account this kind of like intercropping borders. Like that was a bit of a hassle to collect, but that's our approximation of the land area devoted to pulses. Yeah.
So 40% is when you say 40% of my land, I'm sowing.
This is 40% of farmers are growing pulses. Yeah.
But how much of their land they're dedicating?
Yeah. So on average, so conditional on growing, they're growing about 0.1 acre.
0.1 acre.
Yeah.
And do we know like what is the average acre?
We do know that from, I'll back it up and see. Landowned. So yeah, average is 1.34, 1.345, something like that. Yeah. Okay, so you see that gap open up immediately, and then kind of close pretty quickly in some cases. Right? In Rabi, it persists, but it's sort of the gap is steadily closing. So that's the sort of like fading response. That's the lower one, is the area planted. So it's a smaller initial effect. This is the demand curve. So when we use those experimental auctions, we actually find that being exposed to treatment lowers your demand for seeds. Now, one explanation for that is like an anchoring thing where you've been given free seeds the first season, 50% off the second, and then we come and ask you for how much you're willing to pay, and we've already we've lowered your reference price. So that may be part of it.
But is it possible that if I'm growing this season, pulses, I can use my own seeds for next year?
Yep. So exactly. So that's exactly the right question. It's a question we asked, which is why I think it's exactly the right question to ask. That even when we control for how much they've stored, how much they've produced in the past, or how we can kind of predict whether they even have stored seeds. Even that, so that's exactly the right question. But even when you control for that, the treatment, those demand curves almost look the same. Yeah. So I will mention one side experiment we did here that I thought that it's a separate paper, but which was like a salience treatment where there's some of these sessions where we just sort of casually mentioned the name of the partner organization that has been working in this village for some time. And we see some really interesting patterns there. Basically, it's like people have a very specific impression of these NGOs, right? Some NGOs are very liberal and they just give away a lot of free stuff. And so for those, if we just sort of mention that name, the demand goes down even further because they're like, what am I paying for this for? This doesn't make sense. But that's aside. I mean, the main punchline, as I say, is that certainly we don't see dramatic learning effects where farmers are willing to pay a lot more. This actually is where, at least where I thought you. So now ask your question, because I think what was the question you were going to ask earlier?
So what is it that they're learning?
Yeah. From what they weren't doing. Yeah. So that's what I thought it was. So this is potentially something that they would learn, which is like usually they've done this on the periphery. And this, the extension part is really encouraging them to go to monocropping, like dedicate it's a small plot, that's fine. It's fine to be a small plot, but have a small plot where it's monocropped pulses, right? And then when you do that, you can actually follow these other best practices. It's a lot easier to follow the best practices in fertilizer and other things like, so that's one of the things, like over and above like what the control group would have been doing. We actually see, and we do see some effects that the treatment actually did encourage like a response in monocropping, right? So how they were growing them may have been different. The other thing that was different is they had certified seed. It was like the seed quality was better than what they're used to. No evidence. So we see all that, but no evidence of increased pulse yield, right? And yeah, so I'll leave it there. There's all kinds of things I have to bite my tongue on because there's interesting kind of side stories, but a couple of caveats to the yield, but even, you know, with all kinds of adjustments, it's really hard to find significance in any of these treatment variables for yield, right?
Have you also looked at the yield of their main crop? Whether that changed when they to monocropping?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't.
Because my understanding is the reason why they do intercropping is because
Is the nitrogen. It's the nitrogen. Yeah.
Which is supposed to be good to do.
Yeah. I'll have to look at that. Yeah, I don't remember if we've looked at that. But I think we have the data that we could. But so now I'll run through a bunch of these other effects quickly. This is total production, and because we'll see a bunch of these coefficient graphs. So year 1, year 2, year 3, and then the seasons are in each of these, right? So and then 0 will be this line. This is the control mean. So this is like, yeah. So production wise, you see some of these effects, some of these coefficients that are significantly different from 0, but they fade pretty quickly. So that's total production. In market activity, this goes to your question. So we don't really see across these different measures, sales revenue, net profit. But if we look at sales revenue, I mean, sales revenue, they're positive coefficients, but all of them pretty noisy. Maybe you see something on production value. It's close to being maybe significant, but certainly nothing really jumps off the page there. And then consumption. So I mentioned consumption was one of the things we were interested in. So we do see a little bit of an effect on their stock. Like this is the pulses in storage, right? So household stored pulses. It's essentially how many months they had at harvest, how many months they had in storage. You do see a little bit of that when they're producing, and this is what I'm saying. Like you don't see a lot in sales, but this seems to be where those excess pulses were routed into household storage. So then the output price support. So the price support we already talked a fair amount about. So I'll gloss over this. This was in the Kharif season, the output subsidy was for black gram. This was the setup. So the price floor was 56 rupees per kilo, and the subsidy was 6 rupees per kg. That was like a fixed above the market price at the time of the harvest. In the Rabi season, we were procuring lentils, and those are those details. So we do something similar kind of setup, but here instead it's a within household across crops. So we're looking at the amount of inputs devoted to the procured crop, right, relative to other crops, but within the household, right? So we have household. That's one of the main differences here in this specification. We have household fixed effects and crop fixed effects. And what we see is that, you know, maybe this is the only one that really stands out as significant is how much they're selling in the Rabi season, which is the lentil crop. And that's for the subsidy, the 6 rupees per kg. But really nothing. I mean, they're sort of positive, but they're pretty noisy. So even these output price supports don't really move the needle much, right? Even when you make the the minimum support price, when you make that real to farmers, there's almost no supply response.
They are selling, right? I mean, aren't they selling? Isn't that what they're saying?
Yeah, yep. So they are selling. That's what I say. Like so this one you're saying. Yeah. So exactly. So there's some evidence here. They did sell more lentils, and
is it possible that because now I see that's benefit, I can make money. So
Yeah.
and therefore I'm actually reducing
Yeah.
my consumption, household consumption, which is hurting the nutrition in the household.
that it certainly could be. It certainly could be. We don't. We have all those consumption, and what we see is not that. We'd have to look. What we'd have to do is really isolate this. We haven't done that actually. We haven't looked like specifically at lentils. Overall, what we see is that there's no point where the treatment effect on storage goes negative. Like, so we don't see that at the aggregate level with all the pulses pulled together, but that may be worth looking at. So I think it's an interesting point. So it's not that there's no effect. It's just that if there is an effect, it's pretty noisy and it doesn't really jump out statistically, right?
Actually, that's an interesting observation. That by introducing output subsidy, you are hurting them.
Yeah.
Because you're giving them some money, but
You're enticing them to redirect their production. Yep, absolutely. I mean, you're competing with the shadow price of pulses, right?
Exactly.
Yep, that's right. Okay, so let me just I'll conclude here. I think this is just a one slide conclusion. So this is what we find, right? So that inputs and sales seem to respond to price signals, to those early treatment, year 1 and 2. So maybe if Niti Aayog is really committed to supporting pulses, maybe that's the way to go. But it's not like you don't get this big return, this big bang for your buck, because it has to be something longer run, right? Because we don't see that because we don't see the shift to a different equilibrium. So we do see some evidence of learning, but it's just not enough to really push things off the periphery. So I think, and then there's a few studies here that are different that I'll contrast, and I'll come back to one final big picture comment on this one. The first is this Emmerich and Dar paper that's in Odisha. These are quite similar farmers. They actually find that this intensive short-term intervention does actually induce like a change in the equilibrium. It changes equilibrium production portfolios. But it's quite a different decision margin in this case, because what they're looking at is rice farmers and trying to induce them to growing drought-tolerant rice, right? So the margin of the decision is very different than farmers who are growing turmeric, vegetables, rice and wheat, maybe as a rotation, and trying to get them to take pulses seriously. Like the intercrop decision is much more consequential, right? It's a bigger decision. So I think that's the reason why we get. And then there's this other paper that's also on legumes, in this case in Malawi, that actually shows the permanent long run price supports actually do trigger a pretty big supply response. But again, the difference is those are permanent. Now, so this is I think that's, yeah. So this is the last point I was going to make is that the project is, you think about it, now if we step back, and kind of see things in a historical perspective, this is not too surprising. It certainly wasn't too surprising to us. But there were some in Niti Aayog who were genuinely surprised, who were confident that this would work. Big push to a high equilibrium. But one of the reasons it's not too surprising is that all the tinkering on the last mile here is like, what happens at between the supplier and the farmer, and then everything on farm. all of this sudden focus on the last mile, after 50 years of neglecting ag R&D in legumes, it's just bound to fail, right? And it's bound to fail because those legumes just don't have the kind of performance that can hold a candle to what the other alternative crops do, right? So I think there's sort of an open question here about, and unfortunately that's not a very popular policy recommendation, because it's like, yeah, you start really prioritizing R&D and pulses, and then maybe in a generation or two, like maybe you actually see some changes, right? That's not the kind of time step that policymakers like to hear about. But I think that is the reality, is that like the headwinds of sustained kind of relative underperformance of pulses is just too hard to overcome with some last mile interventions. So and I'll stop there, and hopefully that gives us some additional time for questions. Yeah.
Having information on the soil health.
On the soil health. So we don't from this, we did not do soil samples and soil tests from this project. But tell me more, like there's a reason why that, what?
The performance of pulses has been degrading. I would like to believe that it has got directly to do with soil degradation.
Yeah.
And if monocropping is one thing that has come
Yeah.
out,
Yeah.
that can further degrade soil.
Could be. Yeah, could be. I mean, I think, so one of the things that, what that raises in my mind is that I was sort of speaking in sort of general sweeping terms about improved pulse varieties. But to be really specific, one of the places where pulses have fallen way behind other crops in India and elsewhere is fertilizer responsiveness, right? So even if that's true, maybe soils are degraded. It could be that that's part of why they've abandoned pulses. Pulses now are mainly on pretty marginal lands in India. If you look at maps of where pulses have moved, they've migrated to pretty marginal lands, rain-fed, low productivity. If you have access to irrigation and access to fertilizer, I mean, you shouldn't be growing pulses. And that's because pulses don't respond very well to fertilizer, and they don't really respond very well to other inputs as well. But yeah, it's an interesting question, especially because of the nitrogen fixation thing, right? Yeah.
Pulses being pushed to periphery could also be because of cereals being pushed as main crops, right?
I think that's largely what it is. Yeah. So this was not in that sense, like your wording was careful. It was more careful than the words I was choosing. Your wording was that like no one made it a policy priority to push pulses to the periphery. What they made as a policy priority was to promote cereals, staple cereals, and these other crops. And then as a byproduct, obviously, there's a trade-off, and the byproduct was pulses got pushed and they got crowded out to make, yeah, that's a better way to say it.
There's no learning involved here. Even when the structural changes, like if I use the IT, pulses, formulated mechanization.
Yeah.
So farmers buying each and
That's right. I think that's clear here, and I think the reason, other than like they tried doing it as a monocrop. They tried maybe half-heartedly, but they did try to kind of bring it off the periphery, tried to take it more seriously. One way of thinking about that is that the package of practices here did not include anything that was like mind-blowingly new. Now, the breeders will actually probably beg to differ, because the breeders, the varieties that were selected for this. So Niti Aayog has there's I don't know what his formal title is, but he's like the breeder and agronomist advisor, and that person at the time, I think he's changed since then, but at the time this project was being formulated, he had spent his career breeding pulses. So he actually had very strong feelings, and in his like, from his perspective, some of these certified improved lentils and black gram and pigeon pea, he really thought of those as like transformational improvements. So there was reason to think that there was something really new there, but it turns out in practice, it was hard for the farmers to see it stand out. Like, Yeah. In the Odisha case, it actually wasn't so much high yielding. In that case, it was drought tolerant. So rice was already high yielding, and then they added this drought tolerant trait that actually protects farmers from like extended droughts. It was something like, there was something clear to learn. I think that's an interesting point. Yeah. Yep.
Just to understand, was there a pre-entry and exit opinion poll of the farmers, the breeders actually, as to whether they want to get into this or whether they thought it was optional or whether it was just taking time for knowledge?
Yeah.
Or as a sustainable, and whether it would fit in their economics?
Yeah.
Was there any pre-entry and post-exit confirmation?
So there was something like that, but probably not as systematic as you have in mind. Like we had the kickoff meeting, so we convened all these kickoff meetings that were focused on pulses, right? And it was mostly to say, because we did that in control and treated areas. So that pulse meeting, we had to be really careful about, we didn't want to say very much. It was just like, and so that one, there was a lot of listening happening there about like, why, who's growing pulses? Why not? And then they would talk about how my grandfather grew a lot of pulses, but I don't, why don't? And so there was some discussion there. There was a lot of discussion there about pulses in general in the kickoff meeting. What we don't have is really the end, like something at the end. And we were hoping to do that. COVID got in the way, right? And so there was no way, like phone surveys are hard to, so we really wanted to like convene these groups, and the project ended like, 2 months into COVID, and then, yeah.
No, was it like optional for them?
Yeah.
Or was it a sort of forced because they were giving incentives? It was taken up, I mean,
Yeah.
just for the heck of it, not
Yeah.
committed to the program as
Yeah.
such, or what was their input?
Yeah.
At the time?
Yeah, so they, what I do know, because in those years of like intense support, the farmers who were engaged, who became members of this group, they actually found a lot of value in it because they hadn't really thought about pulses at all, right? And this was like, hey, so it totally was optional. They were being like enticed to reconsider, to give pulses a second shot, right? That's kind of give them a second chance. Come in and rethink, and we'll show you a demo plot. They got to look and talk. So I think they did benefit from the experience in a sense. It's just that what they seem to have learned is that their grandfather made the right choice when he left pulses, pushed pulses to the periphery. That seemed to be what they learned. Yeah. Yeah.
So finally, can I say that it was not a very successful experiment? Because it did not really catch on as was expected.
Yeah. So
Yeah. So if we accept it, it was like that. What would you suggest now that we restart the whole thing? How would you approach it?
Yeah. What recommendation?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the first my recommendation actually bridges those two, which is I think the experiment was actually quite successful at demonstrating that this approach wasn't going to work, right? Now, that sounds like just kind of spin, but it's actually important because when we go to Niti Aayog, when we wrote a policy brief, we interacted with them, getting that message across to policymakers is really hard. Like because what they wanted to see was that they were going to get a big bang for their buck, right? They wanted like 2 years, and then we say, look, we did everything we can, and it's a sticky problem, right? You're not going to now. So communicating that is really hard. So my recommendation would basically be this: like if you want to take the pulse problem seriously, you can't just focus on the last mile. Like just stop kind of sending money, and they haven't really done anything more like this. So at least they haven't like scaled up something like this. But I would say like you gotta think seriously about agricultural research and development. Think about the National Ag Research System. Think about collaborations with ICRSAT that has a mandate for some of these leguminous crops, and like start. If you put 5% of the budget for legumes that you have for maize or for rice or wheat, then maybe in 10 years you actually have something really interesting. But yeah, that's not a very popular recommendation for sure. But since you asked for it,
But the macroeconomics, the general tendency for youngsters to prefer the other type of food where legumes don't figure so much. change in which their farmers need to go there.
Yeah. So you're thinking that like food preferences are changing enough that maybe this problem goes away just because people are consuming fewer pulses?
Yeah.
Mhm. Could be.
I mean, the attractiveness of,
Yeah.
or the demand for them might not be so
Might-
lucrative.
They might change. Yep. Yeah.
Farmers' perspective, it might not be worth his
Right.
while to pay that, whereas the food changes are happening, food,
Yeah.
preferences are happening in another direction.
Yeah.
He might as well take his efforts there.
Right.
We won't pay.
Yep. It's a valid point. Yeah, in the corner.
So when you say certified seeds.
Yep.
Were these the native varieties that were picked and certified or the like I'm two more one? Like native seeds were picked and hybridized or the new one that was brought into these lands? Because any new seeds that are brought into a new land that will take time, which is short growth.
Yeah.
So 3 years will not be enough for a particular seed variety to grow.
Yeah.
So certified seeds on what sense?
Yeah, so they were certified new varieties. So they were basically it was the Niti Aayog ag team that worked with breeders to set the menu. So they for each of those crops they worked with breeders to identify what was the best suited crop, new improved pulse crop for these districts. And they created the menu working with breeders. And then those are the ones that we certified. I mean, we access certified seed and sold. One of the things, and only the project could do that because farmers on their own you cannot find certified pulse seeds in the market because it's not lucrative enough. There's no private seed company involvement. If you wanted to, you couldn't, right? You basically have to know someone who's a breeder. And so this was like, or you have to be there are some places in Maharashtra, I guess, or in Madhya Pradesh where they're growing pulses more seriously. And so if you're there, then you could have access. So this was certified new varieties, but as I said, and your point is well taken. If these were like dramatically improved, part of the problem here is that they're not dramatic improvements, right? They're sort of marginal improvements, but they're certified, and the certification is important. I shouldn't doubt. The certification means that they'll germinate, they're reliable, they come directly from a seed producer, right? They were produced as seed, not as grain. Or as pulses, yeah. So, but your point. I mean, I guess the more general way to respond to that is it goes back to kind of the theory of change here. Like the one reaction to this that and you can't be blamed for having this reaction is that you can throw everything you want at these farmers for 2 years, but then when you walk away and things revert, you just weren't there long enough, right? It needed to be 4 years or it needed to be 5 years. That's a fair point. It's just that even 5 years was too long for Niti Aayog, right? Yeah.
Any other questions?
Okay, so I have one last question.
Yep.
I don't know about the seed business, so I'm just trying to understand this. So unless I buy the seeds from the breeders, every time I want this crop, my productivity is not going to be as high. Is that the problem? I can't use my own seeds.
No, you can use your own seeds. So in this case, these seeds can be saved.
Right.
The issue is the real issue is how the seed is stored, right? So if you produce lentil and you select your seed from the harvest, and you have some cool, dark place to store it so that it's still viable in six or 7 months, that's an option. In fact, that's what a lot of them would do. The problem, of course, is that like the clock is ticking on the viability of the seed. It's a living thing. So each month you're losing maybe 5% germination rate, and that's in best conditions. If it's humid and you don't have a very good place for it, it can lose 10 or 20% viability every month, right? So that pretty quickly, or if rats get in it or whatever, right? So if you in the right conditions, that's an option.
Okay.
Yeah.
And did these farmers in the treatment group,
Yep.
they know that it was at the end of second year, it's going to end the subsidy for
Yeah,
seeds?
they knew that it was short term. They knew that like this is a big year. This is the time to learn. There's a demo plot. We're giving free seeds. Next year we'll have the same seeds, but you'll be paying half price. So they knew that from the beginning that there was
And the
Yep.
second year, they knew that this was the last year.
Yep.
and
Yep,
They needed to save the seeds. in
yep, yep, exactly.
And we don't know whether they're continuing or not, like. Here,
We could know that actually. So it's a good reminder to check. So we still have a link to the FPCs through AKF.
Yeah.
And we should reach out and get an update because it's been a number of years. Yeah, it's a good suggestion. Thank you. Yeah.
So on the seeds, if it is a hybrid seed,
Mm.
you need to replace it.
Mhm.
Every 2 years or 3 years you need to replace. If it's a variety, then you can keep it for longer.
Yeah.
So that's the difference.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think this is not a hybrid.
No, they're not. None of this is hybrid. Yep.
So I have one basic question.
Sure.
When we are actually setting up this experiment, a good thing to do would be looking at comparative profitability of alternative crops.
Yeah.
And so on.
Yep.
And then try to see what measure will help in really bringing this out.
Yeah.
As you said, maybe there is no answer to this.
Mhm.
If it is a productivity, as rightly pointed out, so then you can't
Yeah.
meet,
Yeah.
some variety, or whatever. But isn't that a way to have, of course, you said CPIO really takes this for you and then last year. Mostly that's a production view.
Yep.
Not really looking at economics and
Yep.
in
The returns to different crops.
The
Yep.
returns and the risks
Yep.
associated with this
Yep.
versus what they have been practicing
Yeah.
versus what comparative crops are there.
Yep.
So then it would have probably given you right from the beginning itself. So what do we expect the farmers to do? And if they are not, then probably you can try to provide.
Right. Yep, I think that's right. So and that we didn't do that in part because something like that exercise, there are folks, a team at IFPRI has done something like that. To make this point that like under current technologies, that the returns just aren't there for pulses, and it is a matter of risk as well, right? Because the prices, precisely the motivation for the project, pulse prices have been very volatile, and so there's a lot of price risk if you're planning to like devote some part of what was rice to pulses in the hopes of selling, and it's a new crop. There's a lot of risk involved in that sense. So I think your intuition is exactly right, and some of these other studies I think sort of suggest that as well. We didn't do it here because we do have data on the other crops. We sort of took it as given that under current conditions. So in this case, like in one district in particular, turmeric is a really big crop, and farmers can make a lot of money with turmeric. I mean, a lot more than what they could with pulses, right? Or in one of it's tomatoes. It was like tomatoes in one, and these are high value crops. Like you don't need to do too much on the back of the envelope to show that the returns are, not nearly as favorable for pulses. But you're right. That is another approach. The only thing you don't get there is like is sort of you don't get to test the theory of change that maybe you could actually, with a big push, you can push them into a different state of the world, right? You don't. That one's hard to test, but yeah, it has to be a really big push, and then it has to be for a sustained amount of time. Yeah.
The other question, of course, you have also mentioned, one is whether it is actually extension intensive crop or not.
Yeah.
We did some studies that we have exactly similar kind of thing, where we find that the benefits for farmers are much greater in case of cotton compared to other crops like, let's say, even rice or some other crop. So they would follow the practices that we have advised, a lot more in cotton, and they also got a lot more yield and living. So here, as you rightly said, even fertilizer probably was not there in the.
Because they're not that responsive. Yep. That's a good point. Yeah, it's a good point. And with cotton, it's not too surprising, I guess, that you would see returns to extension much higher because it's a more complex production system. Yeah. It's a great point.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks.
Thanks.
Yep.
You said you went to.
Oh, wow. Wow. Thank you.
Of this,
Oh, really?
it's very beautiful.
Is that right?
And there is a plug internet.
Wow. That's fantastic. Mysore. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gopal. Yeah, yeah, it's a pleasure.